Indeed introducing myself. I work for the Amsterdam Institute for Global Health and Development, and I'm program director of the FP7 funded HOOKVAC consortium. And within this consortium, we try to establish one simple goal, and that is to develop a vaccine for hookworm disease. Now, I've been asked to talk about funding challenges, and Jean-François just had a good overview of the different sort of macroeconomic challenges that we all face in product development for neglected diseases. What I would like to do in these hopefully 10 minutes is to give you a bit of a flavor what it actually takes on a project level. So what are our challenges, being just a group of passionate scientists that want to bring a good product to the children who are in need. This is probably also a sort of description of the Valley of Hunger. Imagine lunch being on the right and yourself being on the left. It's sort of how we scientists feel about drug development and vaccine development as well. You know, you have a good idea, you're standing there at the edge, and there at the other side of the valley, there are the investors. But they're just telling you, well, you know, do this one animal study, do a bit of formulation work, do this clinical proof of concept study. It's just quite difficult to get your product to a stage where people are actually willing to fund. And that's true for products that have a commercial market. It's especially true for products in neglected diseases. So I guess we as a group have been actually quite lucky by getting awarded this 7 million or 6 million grant for the development of our vaccine. It basically allows us to do three different things. It allows us to further work on the more downstream development of the vaccine development and manufacturing. It allows for clinical testing of the vaccine, and it also allows for a bit of advocacy. And why the last point is so important, I would like to emphasize in this talk. So this is the consortium. It's actually a nice collaboration between European partners, the American partners that were the originators of the vaccine, and a site in Gabon where all the clinical studies are going to be conducted. And this is a picture of the animal that we're going to target. It's a highly prevalent neglected disease, and it's one of the leading causes of anemia in low and middle income countries. It's a very common disease. It's leading among the NTD list, among which schistosomiasis and leishmaniasis. Over 400 million cases, 3.2 million dailies lost. And it's also a disease that is related to poverty. So it primarily affects people who are poor, but it also increases and amplifies poverty. So it leads to a reduction in wage earning. I'll go through these slides pretty quick to get to the real point about the funding challenges. This is just giving an overview of the life cycle of the worm. It eventually ends up in the intestines, and affected individuals can have many worms, but 25 of these worms already translate to 1 millimole of blood loss, and that's already equivalent to the daily iron intake of a child. So what it actually leads to is clear anemia, which you see in the two slides here, and the take-home message is the more burden of the worms you have, the more severe your anemia becomes. So the originators of this vaccine are people working in the Sabin Vaccine Institute in the United States, and their work started in 2000 and was actually funded originally by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So we're quite happy now that the European Commission has taken over through this FP7 grant, and what we're developing is a bivalent vaccine that has actually two antigens in it that are very relevant for the worm to basically break down the blood that it's ingesting. And the two antigens are being produced in two separate recombinant processes. And one of the things that we're trying to do in this project is actually transfer that technology into a sort of more easy technology that is better scalable than the current technologies. This is just a proof of principle in animals, just to make the point that it's not totally out of the textbooks, but it also has a practical sort of evidence in dogs. What you see here in the basically the picture over there is that the antibodies end up in the small intestines where they're supposed to work. You can see in the graph that the dogs that were vaccinated had a higher hemoglobin level than the controls. And in the bottom graph you can see that the dogs that were vaccinated had a lower burden of worm eggs. So we have in vivo proof of concept of the vaccine candidates in animals, and it's now up to the HOOKVAC program to establish that that also works in humans. Today we learned about a vaccine that has about 50% efficacy. We also believe that our vaccine is not going to be amongst the group that will have 100% efficacy. So therefore we think that the vaccine by itself is an addition to the current interventions, and one of the important interventions that is out there at this point in time is mass drug administrations. So what we have demonstrated by modeling is that actually by adding the vaccine to MDA campaigns, you can actually improve the curve of the epidemic, and you can actually have a significant benefit on the amount of deaths lost. This is the work plan within the program. There's much more on the manufacturing side and on the advocacy side, but this is what we're going to do with clinical trials. So in July, we're going to start our first phase 1 clinical trial in healthy volunteers. That's followed by a clinical trial in school-aged children, who are the ultimate target population for the vaccine. And then the last study that is planned is a challenge study. So that's a study where volunteers are being vaccinated and then subsequently challenged with the worm, which is quite an innovative design. It's being used in malaria studies at the moment and also influenza vaccine studies. It has not been used in worm studies before, but we think it's a great opportunity because if we have a successful readout from this study, it will be a very early indicator that the vaccine will work in humans. So we don't have to wait until phase 2b studies to get our first proof of efficacy. And that by itself, I think, is already a very important innovation if it comes to the cost of doing vaccine clinical studies. One word about the vaccine, and then I will move more towards the challenges that we face. But you know, the ultimate grail that we have in mind, the ultimate goal, is that we develop a successful vaccine. If we manage to do so, we will be able to avoid up to 300 million dailies. It will improve pregnancy and birth outcomes. It will improve cognitive development of children, and therefore it will prevent a lot of human suffering. So this is all nice and good, but we realize that in the complex trajectory of vaccine development, we're only about 30% of the way or so. And you know, transitioning to phase 1 clinical studies, we also get to the point of what you see here, industrial investment needed in order to further move your vaccine forward. Remember that I just showed you that we had a 6 million grant from the European Commission. It only helps us for a very limited part of the overall development of a vaccine. And you know, if you read the different literature estimates about what it takes to develop a vaccine, the sort of most conservative estimate is 100 million. Some less conservative estimates even go beyond $1 billion. So clearly, we need to do more to get a vaccine to the market. And who is going to help us with that? The first obvious partners to look at, for obvious reasons, are the pharmaceutical companies that develop vaccine products. We have to realize, though, that the pharmaceutical development, or that vaccine development is only a small fraction of the total sales of worldwide pharma. So it's only 1.5 to 3%. And there's also a limited number of players in this field. And what you see in the right panel is already a somewhat outdated figure. We know from recent newspaper coverage that GSK and Novartis have some plans to join their forces. J&J is not yet on that slide. They were not in the field in 2007. They are now, after they acquired Crucell. But nonetheless, the number of industrial partners is limited, especially compared to the world of pharmaceuticals. You also see a category other in here, and that merely reflects upcoming economies where more and more manufacturers start to get pre-qualification. And we think that that category other can be very important for us. I'll come back to that in a few slides. Skip this one for the sake of time, and just wanted to add another element to the macroeconomic discussion that Jean-François already mentioned. And it is that Europe always has been very strong in the vaccine field, traditionally, but it's sort of losing ground. The positive interpretation of this slide is that you can see that the amount of funding available for vaccine R&D is clearly increasing. So that's very, very good. What we find a bit worrying is that the amount of European part of this is actually decreasing. And obviously these figures vary from year to year. I think, discussed in 2008, if we extrapolate this figure to 2013 and 2014, the European Commission will definitely do better. The HOOKVAC project is a demonstration of that. But I think it's important that Europe keeps focus on the fact that it has always been good in vaccine development, and it needs to remain to do so over the years to come. One thing that we find particularly worrisome is that for most vaccine development in entities, we have to have PDPs for the product development. It has been discussed at several of the discussions today. This was already covered by Jean-François, but what I would like to show you is this particular graph. So if you look at the G-Finder report of Polysecure's, all the figures are actually on the rise or quite stable, which by itself is quite an achievement given the fact that we had such a deep economic crisis over the last 5 years. But the one thing that hasn't increased is the amount of funding in PDPs. Actually, the amount of funding of PDPs is on the decline, and it has been so for a couple of years already, 20% in 2012. The reason for that is perhaps a bit up to debate. One interpretation is that it's a reflection of the fact that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation have been so instrumental in funding the early years of PDPs, are slowly getting out of that field and reorienting their funding. But obviously other parties need to step in, because the big challenge for vaccine development in neglected diseases is this trend is not bended, where we really will run into serious problems. Another way to look at this is actually looking at the amount of R&D funding compared to the amount of DALYs that is actually lost by a particular category of diseases. And what you can clearly see here in the slide is this tremendous bias that the pharmaceutical industry has towards chronic diseases. Chronic diseases translates into chronic treatment and therefore much more affordable business models than for a vaccine where, almost by definition, you only have a single dose or maybe 3 shots that would be enough to cure a patient from a disease. So $71 per daily lost for the non-communicable diseases as diabetes, cardiovascular disease, cancer. If we get to the neglected diseases, including the big 3, it's $14. If we take out the big 3, it's $10. And then if we get down to my field, which is the helminth diseases, then we get to $6. And perhaps from a public health perspective, even more worrisome, if you take bacterial diarrhea and bacterial pneumonia, which are big killers, which are faced by an epidemic of increasing drug resistance and multi-drug resistance, we see that only $2 per daily per daily loss is being spent. And that's a challenge for development of products in neglected diseases, but it's also a challenge for us in the West. If we don't do something about the growing epidemic of gram-negative infections, if we don't do something about MRSA and other gram-positive infections, we will have a significant public health issue in this part of the world as well. But coming back to our program, I've talked about a bit about the development cost in R&D. There's also the issue of delivery. It takes at the moment in a developing country about $30 to get a child fully immunized. And that number is actually not met in a significant part of the world. This slide comes from the 7th Vaccine Institute that did a survey in 15 of the countries where they have specific programs running. And what you see here is that the amount of funds available for child immunization is actually on the increase. That's the positive news on this slide, but it's nowhere where it needs to be, with only $10 in these countries in 2010. And new vaccines like ours are only to increase the cost, not decrease the cost. So we need to do something on the delivery side as well. And then, as a group, we face that funding is not the only hurdle. So if you, for example, talk about WHO pre-qualification, what you need at some point in time if you're developing a vaccine, you have to go through this process that is supposed to guarantee the quality and the safety and efficacy of the vaccines that come to the market. The problem with that is that the current policy is that vaccines are only being put on the vaccine priority list, as you see in the last bullet point, if they're high priority vaccines. If you're a low priority vaccine, your placement on that list may actually be postponed, and then they say depending on the workload that they have. That's a nice way of saying at this point in time we only put vaccines on the list that are actually preventing mortality. So if you're developing a vaccine that's targeted towards preventing morbidity, then currently you cannot get on the list. So despite all the funding that we now get from the European Commission, despite all the funding issues that we still have and all the scientific challenges, there's also the element that we need to do advocacy to make sure that that priority list is going to change, because we believe, and strongly believe, that morbidity-related vaccines also should get on that list. And that's not going to be an easy task, because the same group that does the pre-qualification also has to take into account that the complexity of the products that get into the market are becoming increasing. There are many new manufacturers from developing countries. What's listed here is China and Thailand, but we can easily add to that list Iran, Cuba, Bangladesh. So there's a lot of extra effort that they need to do in terms of qualification of all those manufacturers. There's more attention for regional issues. So vaccine development traditionally has always been for global issues. There may now be regional pockets that you regionally want to target with specific vaccines, and perhaps hookworm is part of that. So there's a lot of challenges that these people need to go through, and that's within a setting where actually their staffing is actually less, not more than it was in 2008. So the last part, 2 minutes more, and then I'm done. What needs to change? Well, first, on the general level, I think that we here in Europe have to be aware that we need to stay ahead in this field. We need to make sure that Europe is and remain strong in the vaccine development field, including the field for neglected diseases. For our project, we have identified that it's important for us to liaise early with these manufacturers from developing countries. Our ultimate goal is to transfer these technologies, or the technology around our vaccine strategy, to manufacturers in developing countries, with the goal to produce a vaccine that can be marketed for $1 or less. We see it as our task to be an advocate to change the rules for pre-qualification. We think that our vaccine actually can have a lot of benefit in preventing disease, and that should be a reason to get on the priority list as well. And we are aware that apart from the fact that we're very happy that we got the 6 million euros, we need to raise a lot more funds. So that's what we're going to do in the next coming years. I skipped that one, just to mention that we are currently applying for a Europe Aid grant that hopefully will help us to liaise with these manufacturers in developing countries. And rather than giving a whole list of names that should be recognized for composition of this talk, I would like to show a slide of the staff that attended the kickoff meeting of our consortium in Amsterdam. And that's it. Thank you.